Told you. So, turn the game down. Need some help? Okay. Hello? Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. There we go. Now we got it. So tonight, welcome back, by the way. Glad you're awake still. Tonight we wrap up our journey through the book of Ruth, which will take us basically through the entire time period of the Judges. And so go ahead and turn in your Bibles with me to Ruth chapter 4. That's going to be our passage for this evening, where we'll be spending all of our time. But before we get there, before we read today's passage, it's time for previously on in the Bible, so we can kind of remember where we were. So remember, when we started Ruth chapter 1, Elimelech had left Bethlehem and moved to Moab with his family. And while they were there, he and his sons died, and they were there about 10 years. And Naomi, Elimelech's wife, tells her daughters-in-law to leave. Hey, look, I'm not going to have any more sons. It's not going to be possible for me to give you any more husbands, so y'all just go back to your family. Because remember, Orpah and Ruth were both Moabites. They had left their families, left their gods, and left their land to go and marry Mahlon and Chilion. And after Mahlon and Chilion died, Naomi says, look, I'm going to go back home. Y'all stay here, stay with your family, stay with your people, stay with your land, stay with your gods. And Orpah goes, cool, peace, I'm out. And Ruth devotes herself not only to Naomi, but to her God. She says, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And so Ruth and Naomi return to Bethlehem, and Ruth has to find a way to help them survive, to take care of Naomi. And so she goes to gather the gleanings, the leftovers of the harvest, which is something that God had instituted back in Leviticus. This is when you glean your harvest, don't take it all. Don't take the edges. Don't go back over it a second time. Anything that's left in the field is supposed to be for the widow and the foreigner. And so she goes into the fields to get some grain to help Naomi and her survive. And she happens into the field of Boaz. And we spent a long time talking about how that happening wasn't so much a happening as God's direction. And so she and Boaz have their little meet cute, if this was a romantic comedy. And Boaz says, hey, look, stay with my people. There's a lot of shady business going on out there. Stay with my people. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to take care of you. In fact, he tells his harvesters, hey, leave a little extra out. And so they left so much out that she actually gleaned an ephah of grain that first day, which we learned last week was between 30 and 60 pounds. And so he provides for her, and they go through the whole harvest together doing this. And then Ruth goes to him at night during the winnowing process, the threshing process, and proposes marriage. And she does it at night to keep him from embarrassment in case he didn't want to be her kinsman redeemer. And so Boaz says, yes, I will be your kinsman redeemer, but we have a problem. There is a kinsman that is closer than I. So tomorrow morning, as soon as I can, I'm going to go and I will settle this tomorrow. I will check with the closer redeemer, and if he will redeem you, he will redeem you, and if not, I will. And so Ruth and Naomi that's where we left at the end of Ruth chapter 3, verse 18. So now we pick up in Ruth 4, verses 1 through 6. It says, now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, come aside, friend, sit down here. So he came aside and sat down. Then he being Boaz, took 10 of the men, the elders of the city, and said, sit down here. So they sat down. Then he said to the close relative, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you. And the closer relative, said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. And the close relative says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was, so that's where we're stopping right now. Before we get too far, let's jump over to Leviticus chapter 25. And this passage is what sets up this whole kind of process of the kinsman redeemer. We'll go to Leviticus 25. We'll pick up in verse 23. So this is Leviticus 25:23. The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in the land of your possession you shall grant redemption to the land. If one of your brethren becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, and if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother sold. Or if the man has no one to redeem it, then he himself shall be able to redeem it. Then let him count the years since its sale and restore the remainder to the man who he sold it, that he may return to his possession. But if he's not able to have it restored to himself, then what was sold shall remain in the hand of him who has bought it until the year of Jubilee. And in the Jubilee it shall be released and shall return to his possession. If a man sells a house in a walled city, then he may redeem it within a year. After that, within a full year, he may redeem it. But if it's not redeemed within a space of a year, then the house in the walled city shall belong permanently to the man who bought it. Throughout his generations, it shall not be released in the year of Jubilee. However, the house of blah, 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 blah. So we kind of get the process that God here, God is establishing this idea of the kinsman redeemer here, that because he wanted to ensure that the division of the land in the promised land always stayed with those families, that people wouldn't fall on hard times, and then their entire possession of the land of the promised land would be gobbled up by just a few, and so that every family would always have a possession in the promised land. And so to make sure that happened, that whenever families and tribes would run into trouble and had to sell it, then there was a way to redeem it. And this kind of all hinges on two separate important laws that God implemented. The first is the year of Jubilee, which is every 50 years, all the land, no matter who owned it, would return to the original family. And everything, when you were selling a piece of property, you weren't necessarily selling the property, you were selling the rights for that property until the year of Jubilee. So if I sold my rights right after the year of Jubilee, I could sell that property for more because I had 49, 48, 50 years till the next year of Jubilee where it would return to my possession than if I sold it in year 48 or 49. Because then that person could only use that piece of land for a year before it was returned back to me. So that was the year of Jubilee. The second was the kinsman redeemer, which is what we'd read this passage here. That a relative can buy back or redeem a property to keep it in the family at any time before it's my understanding, it's at any time before the year of Jubilee. So if my dad dies and I had to sell the family farm, my uncles or my cousins could come along and buy it back from whoever I sold it to keep it within the family. Similarly, flip over with me to Deuteronomy 25. This is the other side of this discussion that we're going to be having. So that was the kinsman redeemer, and this side is the Levirate marriage. So this is chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name shall not be blotted out of Israel. But if the man does not want to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up the name of his brother in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of this city shall call him and speak to him, but if he stands firm and says, I do not want to take her, Then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and answer and say, so it shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of whom who has had his sandal removed. Keep that in mind, okay? As we go forward in the rest of this, keep that whole concept of the sandal in mind. So what would happen with this Levirate marriage is a brother would die. Two brothers were living together. One brother died. He didn't have any kids. So the other brother would take his sister-in-law as his wife, bear kids with her, and the firstborn son of that union would be legally the dead brother's son, the dead brother's heir. And that prevented a family line from going extinct in Israel. So this is the cultural context of everything we're about to jump into here in Ruth chapter 4. So the very first thing we see in verse 1 is simply a matter of geography. And we kind of mentioned it last week that now Boaz went up to the gate. So he went up to the gate. So the threshing floor, we know kind of just in general, that would have been below the city gate. We saw this in Ruth 3, verse 6, where it says she went down from the city to the threshing floor. So interesting, yes. Meaningful, not at all. But what is important is that he went to the city gate. This was the place of business. This was the closest thing to a courthouse that they had. This is where civil matters were handled for the city and for individuals. You see this throughout the Old Testament, that they would gather at the city gate to hash out these things, where this is where the prophets would kind of speak to the city, is at the city gate. And this is where the elders would gather, because that's the closest thing to government they had in the time of Judges. Because remember, in the time of the Judges, there was no king, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So each individual city, each individual town had a group of elders that kind of helped keep things running and help make local decisions for their town and for their city. Because pretty much everybody would have to pass through that gate at some point, whether they were heading out to their fields to harvest or to take care of business, or whether they were heading back in to do business and to go home or whatever. So almost everybody passed through the city gate at some point. And Boaz knew that this is where, one, business would get done, and two, the close relative would come by at some point during the day. So when the closer relative comes and passes through the gate, Boaz calls out to him and it says, hey, so-and-so, which is kind of the implication for the word that's translated here as friend. It's the biblical equivalent of, hey, that guy, hey, you, or hey, John Doe. So it's interesting that throughout this account, we have no context of who this guy is, other than he is a closer relative. That is the only fact we know, that he was a closer relative than Boaz to Elimelech. His name is forgotten, but Boaz's name is recorded in history. The man who didn't redeem is forgotten, but the Redeemer is recorded in history. Boaz calls and says, hey, you dude that I need to see, come over this way. And so he comes over, and Boaz asks, hey, 10 elders, hey, sit down and be witnesses to this. This is where they're getting down to business. They had enough, he had enough witnesses and elders for this to be official, like civil government business. And Boaz tells him, hey, relative, Naomi is in the process of selling her fields. That's what it means in verse 3. Naomi, who has come back from the country of Boaz, sold. The context, that the verb tense of that word sold, is actually closer to in the process of selling. She hasn't, the transaction hasn't been completed, but she's in the process of selling that field. So if you want to buy it, hey, now is the time to buy it, But if not, just let me know. Man, the relative is like, heck yeah, I get some more fields. I'm going to add that to my farm. That'll quadruple my production or whatever. I don't know. So he says, yes, I'm going to do it. And then Boaz, hey, remember, if you take responsibility for the fields, you're taking responsibility for the bloodline too. Now, the law, as it was laid out by God, as we looked at in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, doesn't require this. So we aren't entirely sure why he makes this connection together. It could be that Boaz was really trying to live out the spirit of the law, the spirit of the continuation of that line, that he was devoted to that. Or it could be that the local tradition had combined the two that says, when you have a field and you have a levirate situation, both of those things go hand in hand. And if you take responsibility to the one, you got to retake responsibility for the other. But either way, it must have been something that they were familiar with, because the relative didn't object. He wasn't like, no, that's not the way we do it. That's not what we do at all. Instead, he said, look, I can't do that. I'm going to have to turn this deal down. And he turned it down because he didn't want to dilute his inheritance. Because the child that was produced from this marriage to Ruth wouldn't just inherit all of Mahlon's inheritance, which it's in this area that we actually learned that Boaz was married to Mahlon. We didn't know that before this point. So not only is this child going to receive all of Mahlon's inheritance, he's also going to receive some of the inheritance of the dad, the closer relative. And that's going to kind of dilute his family property. Now, when it was originally pitched, he might have been open to the idea because Naomi was past childbearing age. And so it's like, look, I can take the field, I can marry Naomi, she's not going to have any more kids, not going to dilute my inheritance. But when he brings up Ruth, he's like, whoa, hold up. Because there's a lot of situations going on here. Not only is Ruth young enough to bear kids, Ruth is also a Moabitess. And Ruth is also the wife of like a guy that died in who knows what kind of situation. So he doesn't necessarily want to buy into that family where Elimelech died and Mahlon died and Chilion died. And he doesn't want to get into that situation because he's not exactly sure how that's going to turn out. Besides the fact, on top of the fact, that his inheritance is going to be diluted. He cared more about keeping his share of his property than he cared about keeping the law of God. Because remember, this is commanded by God, that this is what should happen. And he says, no, I'm not going to keep the law of God because I want to keep my inheritance. And we wonder why his name isn't even recorded in this book. Let's move on. Pick up in Ruth 4, verse 7 through verse 12. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm anything, one man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was a confirmation in Israel. Therefore, the close relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, and he took off his sandal. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, see, this is where we learned that Ruth was the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses this day. And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. And may you prosper in Ephrath and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman. We see the sandal present in the Levirate marriage in Deuteronomy 25. The sandal represented the rights to the property. The sandal represented the rights to the property. And so when he took his sandal off and said, hey, I'm going to give you my sandal, I'm handing you my sandal, he is symbolically handing his rights to the property, his rights as kinsman redeemer from himself over to Boaz. And with the transaction complete, the elders sign off on it. And they give Boaz a blessing, basically saying, we hope you have many babies and are very prosperous. In fact, they bring up 3 different women here. They bring up the founding women of the city of Bethlehem, in Rachel and Leah. And they tie Ruth's story to the story of Tamar, Judah, and Perez. Now, if you remember that story, Tamar was married to Judah's oldest son. And the Lord struck him down because he displeased the Lord. And so Judah did what was right and gave Tamar to the next oldest son. And that son refused to have children with Tamar, and so God struck him down. The third son was too young to be married, so Judah says, hey, why don't you go back to your father's house? When this son is old enough, I'll send for you, and you can marry him. Well, the time came and went, and Tamar never was sent for. So she went and disguised herself as a prostitute and met Judah along the way, and they went into the tent, and she took his ring. And so when Tamar came up pregnant, Judah was like, this cannot stand. We're going to kill her. And Tamar goes, oh, really? Well, whoever belongs to this ring belongs to this baby. And Judah goes, you are more righteous than I. And so out of that birth of Judah and Tamar was born Perez. And according to 1 Chronicles 2, if you want to go and look up that family line, Perez was the main ancestor of the Ephrathites and the Bethlehemites. So Perez was responsible for the founding of the people of Ephrath and Bethlehem. So what the elders are saying here is saying, we hope that Ruth, this marriage with Ruth, bears you as much prosperity and as much legacy and as much honor in this Levirate marriage as within our founding Levirate marriage in Tamar and Judah and Perez. This was their founding, and they were hoping and praying and blessing Boaz with equal success. That relationship would bear out to have the same kind of impact on the community that Perez did in Ephrath and in Bethlehem. Let's move on to Ruth 4:13 through 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Let's pause right there before we go any further. So she had been barren for quite a while, because they were in, if you remember back in Ruth chapter 1, they had been in Moab for about 10 years. And we're not exactly sure how long it was that they were back before this whole story transpires to the conclusion. But her womb had been closed for quite a while. And so it says the Lord gave her conception. Verse 14, then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, and your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. Also, the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "There is a son to Naomi," and they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. This is the moment that all of this story has been leading to. This is the moment of the heir, the child of the redeemed and the redeemer. This is what this whole process has been for, is for this kid. But take note, in verse 14, we've been talking about, for this, basically this whole chapter, in chapter 2 and chapter 3 and early in chapter 4, every time we talk about the close relative, we're talking about Boaz, but in verse 14, it swaps. The close relative that they're talking about here in verse 14 is Obed, not Boaz. The close relative is Obed, not Boaz. Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a close relative, and his name may be famous in Israel. This is the same blessing that Boaz received himself in verse 11. That his name may be great in Israel. And it's now being bestowed on Obed, the son. This blessing on Naomi also compares Ruth to 7 sons. Now, in this culture, sons were preferred to daughters. And 7 was the number of completion. So if you had 7 sons, you had a complete family. And what they're saying here is this one woman, this one lowly Moabitess woman, is worth more to Naomi and is more valuable to Naomi than what their culture considered the perfect, complete family. That Naomi had brought more that Ruth had brought more to their family than 7 sons could have. Verses 18 through 22, we're wrapping it up here. The chapter, not the message. So don't get excited. Now, this is the genealogy of Perez. So remember, Perez was Tamar and Judah's kid that we were talking about. There was this first Levirate situation that birthed the founders of Ephrath and Bethlehem. Now, this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Amminadab. Amminadab begot Nahshon. Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz. Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse. And Jesse begot David. So, through this genealogy, we can begin to answer some of the questions about the timeline of when this occurred that I've been alluding to. Because if you remember, I said early on that there's 2 different timelines, 2 different spots kind of in Judges where this could have happened. It could have happened early on in Ehud or later on in around the time of Jair. So when in Judges did this happen? Well, we got to do some math. These 10 generations represent about 900 years. So the question has to be, is this genealogy complete? Or did it just highlight the notable ancestors? If the genealogy is complete, then some convoluted math puts Ruth around 1284 BC. And if Ruth happens around 1284 BC, then some really neat and interesting things happen. Because 1284 BC was around the time of King Eglon and Ehud. Now remember, Eglon was the king of Moab. Ruth is a Moabitess. So that means Elimelech left Bethlehem during the famine, during the reign and oppression of King Eglon, to leave God's country and go into the enemy's country. Not just like the ancestral enemy's country, but the active enemy's country. And so he goes from Bethlehem into Moab. And so that means Elimelech's family was in Moab during the reign of Eglon. And then Ehud kills Eglon, and they come back to Bethlehem as Ehud begins to judge Israel. So a couple of things happen there. One, if it's that early in the book of Judges, it is a possibility that Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion died fighting for the Moabites, fighting against Israel. Possibility. The other thing that happens, which I think is even neater, is that Rahab, the prostitute from Jericho, if you go back into the lineage, Rahab married a man named Salmon. If you look at this genealogy, Salmon begat Boaz. So Boaz, the kinsman redeemer, was the son of Rahab the prostitute from Jericho and Salmon. So Boaz would know what it was like for a woman to be coming in to a foreign culture, to be accepted and be redeemed by God, which could explain his supreme devotion to redeeming Ruth. So that's some really interesting things. That's some really interesting thoughts, really interesting parallels, really interesting motivations. But does anything change if this genealogy is not complete? If they skipped some generations? Is Ruth still redeemed? Yes. Is the Moabitess still in the lineage of Jesus? Yes. Nothing about what we are given changes this story at all, other than some interesting facts and tidbits that aren't even in Scripture. Nothing changes if the genealogy is incomplete. The word begat here can just as easily be applied father to son as it can grandfather to grandson or great-grandfather to great-grandson, and so on and so on. It doesn't quite equate generation to generation, boom, boom, boom. The Bible isn't wrong here. Our understanding of the word is. Our understanding of that word begat is what is wrong. Because we need to understand that the Bible isn't meant to be a play-by-play of history, giving exact details of every event. But here's the important part. The details it does give are 100% accurate. So, to say that Salmon begot Obed is just as it is just as valid for it to be Salmon being the grandfather or great-grandfather as it is for Salmon to be the father. It may not give you every link in the chain, but the chain links that it gives you are correct. Because if you're going along and you're looking at this chain and you go, there's one, hey, there's an interesting one, hey, there's an interesting one, hey, there's an interesting one. Better example, if I've got a length of chain that has multiple colors in it, and I just mention it every time one comes around that's red. It says on this chain, there's a red one, and then after that, there was another red one, and then after that, there was another red one. That is accurate. Even though there may be a yellow, a blue, and a green, and a purple, and a fuchsia, and a magenta, all between those. To know that we know that in this chain there were 10 red ones is just as accurate as to know every single link in that chain. So why was this story passed around Israel and eventually written down? We know it wasn't written down like immediately when it happened, because you get verse 7 and verse 4 where it kind of explains the cultural context of passing this sandal back and forth. But why was this story passed around and eventually written down? What does it tell us about God and our relationship with Him? From the Jewish perspective, this is just another important link in the chain of the lineage of David. This gets us from Perez through an important link in the chain to David. And an incredible example of the law of God being upheld in that process of the kinsman redeemer, of the Levirate law in action. The story of Boaz's rescue of a poor Moabite woman and the Moabitess' commitment to Yahweh. But from the Christian perspective, this is a foretelling of God's redemption for us on the cross. That Jesus paid the price to redeem us. This is a foretelling of God's redemption for us on the cross. I want you to look at all the transactional language used here in chapter 4. Verse 3, Naomi, who's come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land. Verse 4, I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back. If you will redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me. For there is no one to you but redeem it. I am next after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Verse 5, on the day you buy the field, you must also buy it from Ruth. Verse 6, I cannot redeem it for myself. You redeem it, my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Verse 8, close relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. Verse 9, you are witnesses today that I bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hands of Naomi. Transactional language is used 14 times in these 6 verses. 14 times in these 6 verses. It's buying, it's selling, it's redeeming. And that word means to set free by paying a price. There is a transaction that occurs when we redeem something, that we are freeing something by paying a price. Because redemption doesn't happen without cost. In Leviticus 27, just a couple over from where he's talking about this right of redemption, it's talking about if you dedicate something to the Lord, to redeem it, you must pay the original value plus 20%. It costs more to redeem something than it did just to buy it outright. Ruth's redemption cost Boaz. There had to be a price for her rescue. Our redemption, our lives, our salvation weren't freely won. They were paid for by the body and the blood of Jesus. Because blood has always been the cost of life. Look at Genesis 3:21. Also for Adam and his wife, the Lord made tunics of skin and clothed them. Where do you think that skin came from? An animal had to be sacrificed to cover them for their sin. Death and blood were required to cover their sin. The very first sin required death and blood to be covered. Exodus 12:23, this is Moses telling the Jews, the Israelites, about the Passover. It says, for the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your house and to strike you. Blood was required for death to pass over. Death and blood were required to cover sin, and death and blood was required for death to pass over. Now Leviticus 17:10-14. And whatever a man of the house of Israel or the strangers who dwell among you eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood, and I will cut them off from among his people. Verse 11, listen to this. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. Therefore, I said to the children of Israel, no one among you shall eat blood, nor shall any stranger who dwells among you eat blood. Whatever man of the children of Israel or the stranger who dwells among you who hunts and catches any animal or bird that may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with dust. Verse 14, for it is the life of all flesh. The blood sustains its life. The sacrifice of blood on the altar is what covered sins. Blood is what atones for our souls because the blood sustains life. Death and blood were required to cover sin. Death and blood were required for death to pass over. And blood is what atones for our souls and sustains our life. The cost of our redemption was always going to be blood. That is why Christ paid our debts and bought our redemption with his blood, because there was no other way to redeem life. I saw, your pastor is a bad influence on me. I'm just going to go ahead and put that out there. He gets me watching these TikToks that just make me mad and make me want to throw my phone. I saw one the other day it was these two people sitting there having a discussion, and the question was asked, why did Jesus have to die for our sins? And this absolute person said, well, he didn't. No, life requires life to be redeemed. Death and blood are required for our redemption. Jesus was always going to have to die, to bleed for us to be redeemed, because the blood is where the atonement of our souls is. Jesus' blood was always going to be necessary. But the kinsman redeemer had to be a relative. Our kinsman redeemer has to be a close relative. So Jesus' incarnation of God in human flesh brought him close. He suffered. He was tempted. He endured all the emotions and all the hungers that we do. He knows us because he's experienced all the things we do. Hebrews 4:15 puts it this way, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but in all points tempted as we were, yet without sin. He knows what it's like. He came to be a close relative. He came to live among us, to be our kinsman redeemer. Just like we talked about at the end of chapter 3. We are the Ruth of this story. We are the ones coming to Christ empty and vulnerable. We are the enemy of God coming and asking for redemption. Just like Ruth, the Moabitess, the enemy of the Israelites, that God says they can't enter the congregation, the assembly, for 10 generations. We are asking to be adopted into God's family, to be redeemed, to be cleansed. And God is faithful and certain in his redemption to make us full, to protect us, to cleanse us, to adopt us into his family, to give us legal standing, to offer us protection not just in the future, not just eternal life, but now. This story illustrates for all people God's plan for redemption of not just the Jews, but the Gentiles as well. This story illustrates for all people God's plan for redemptions for the Jews and the Gentiles. And it should be a reminder of our place in the story and the price of our redemption. For joining us online, thank you so much. We hope to see you very, very soon.